At 8:14 a.m. on October 24, 1944, Captain Thomas Wexler banked his F-6F Hellcat over the sea beyond sea, squinting through a reflector sight at a sky that had turned into a wall of screaming metal. Below him, the Big E, the USS Enterprise, was a sitting duck. Above him, a swarm of Japanese Zeros moved like a secondary coastline, blacking out the horizon. But as Wexler's thumb hovered over the trigger, he was haunted by a gamble that had his squadron calling him a dead man. While every other pilot in Fighting 10 relied on the bright ribbons of tracer fire to guide their aim, Wexler's 6.50 caliber machine guns were dark. He had stripped every glowing round from his belts, loading 2,400 rounds of pure, invisible armor-piercing incendiary lead. To the Navy, it was blind suicide. To Wexler, tracers were just a neon sign telling the enemy where to dive. He pushed into a vertical dive, the airframe groaning under $5G, about to prove that what you can't see is what kills you. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The air over the Philippines didn't smell like the tropics anymore. It smelled of high-octane 100-octane fuel and the ionized static of 1,000 frantic radio calls. On the radar screens deep within the Enterprise, the Japanese center force wasn't appearing as individual dots. It was a solid mass of interference moving at 300 knots. Admiral Kurita had thrown his entire remaining air wing into a final desperate roll of the dice. Standing in their way was Wexler, a man the ordnance crew called the ballistics obsessive. While other pilots spent their last night on the Big E writing letters or playing poker, Wexler had been in the humid, oil-slicked belly of the ship, arguing with a Master Chief over a pile of ammunition. "Tracer rounds lie to you, Chief," Wexler had argued, his hands stained with gun oil. "They're lighter than the API rounds. At 400 yards, your tracers are hitting the tail while your real lead is falling short. Plus, the moment you fire, you're giving the Japanese pilot a laser pointer back to your cockpit." The chief had laughed. Removing tracers was like trying to win a knife fight in a blackout. But Wexler knew the secret of the Japanese A6M0. It was a masterpiece of agility, but it was a flying Zippo. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor. You didn't need to see where you were hitting if you knew the geometry of the kill. He wanted hot belts, 100% M8 armor-piercing incendiary. Now, at 15,000 feet, the theory met the reality of war. The R-2800 double Wasp engine in front of him roared, a 2,000 horsepower beast that vibrated so violently Wexler's vision blurred. The suicide mix was loaded. As the first Zero crossed his path, Wexler didn't wait for a visual stream of fire to correct his lead. He calculated the deflection, trusted the math of his invisible guns, and pulled the trigger. The sky didn't light up with American tracers. Instead, the Zero simply, and inexplicably, erupted into a fireball. The Japanese pilot never saw the ghost coming. The night of October 23, 1944, was thick with the kind of tropical humidity that turned the interior of the USS Enterprise into a slow cooker. Deep in the steel bowels of the carrier, specifically in the forward ordnance magazine, the air was heavy with the scent of cosmoline, gun oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of brass. Captain Thomas Wexler stood over a workbench, his sleeves rolled up, his eyes fixed on a 400-round belt of .50 caliber ammunition. Beside him, Chief Petty Officer Miller, a man who had loaded enough belts to wrap around the equator, watched with a mixture of professional disgust and genuine concern. "You're asking for a court-martial or a funeral, Captain?" Miller grunted, wiping sweat from his forehead with a grease-stained rag. "Navy Bureau of Aeronautics mandates a 4-to-1 ratio. For API 1 tracer. It's the only way you'll know where you're throwing the lead." Wexler didn't look up. He was busy using a pair of pliers to extract AM-20 armor-piercing incendiary tracer round from the belt, tossing it into a discard bin like a piece of rotten fruit. "The tracers lie to you, Chief. That's the problem. Physics doesn't care about Navy manuals." Wexler picked up a standard M8 armor-piercing incendiary round, the silver-tipped bullet that was the backbone of American aerial dominance. "Look at the weight. A tracer round has a hollowed-out base filled with a pyrotechnic magnesium compound. As it flies, that compound burns away. The bullet loses mass. By the time it reaches 400 yards, the tracer is lighter and more susceptible to drag than the solid API rounds. It starts to rise and drift. You see your tracers arching over the target and you dip your nose to compensate, but your real killing rounds, the heavy ones, were already on target. You're correcting for a lie. The chief shook his head, but Wexler continued, his voice dropping into the clinical tone that had earned him the Ghost moniker. But the real danger isn't the ballistic mismatch. It's the psychology. When you fire a tracer, you're giving the Japanese pilot a glowing neon sign. He sees the light, he breaks left, and you've lost the solution. I want my guns dark. I want 2,400 rounds of M8 API. No warnings. No visual aids. Just invisible fire that hits with the same weight, every single time. It's called blind suicide for a reason, sir, Miller argued, gesturing to the heavy Browning M2 barrels stacked against the bulkhead. If you lose your lead pursuit in the middle of a high-deflection turn, you've got nothing to guide you back. You'll be punching holes in the clouds while the Zeros are punching holes in you. I'll trust the math, Chief, Wexler said, sliding a fresh M8 round into the link. Load the belts. All 6 guns. Dark. By midnight, the rumors had already swept through the ready room. The other pilots of Fighting 10 laughed, calling it a janitor's obsession. But beneath the jokes was a cold realization. Wexler was heading into the largest naval engagement in history without the one thing every pilot relied on for survival. As the hangar deck crews began hoisting the Hellcats onto the elevators in the pre-dawn darkness of October 24th, Wexler's F6F sat apart, its gun bays sealed over belts of pure, silent death. He was betting his life that silence was more lethal than sight, unaware that in just a few hours, he would find himself at the center of an enemy formation so dense that even the math would start to fail him. But as he climbed into the cockpit, Wexler noticed something the ordnance crew had missed. A small, jagged vibration in the stick that shouldn't have been there. The air in the ready room of Fighting Squadron 10 was a thick soup of Lucky Strike smoke and the nervous, metallic tang of men who knew they were flying into a meat grinder. On the morning of October 24, 1944, the Grim Reapers of the Enterprise weren't just staring at the mission board. They were staring at Captain Thomas Wexler. To his left, Lieutenant Boots Miller leaned back, his flight suit damp with sweat, tossing a silver dollar against the steel bulkhead. The rhythmic clink-clink was the only sound besides the low hum of the ship's ventilation. Blind suicide, Miller finally muttered, catching the coin mid-air. The name had started as a joke during the late-night briefing, but by 0700 hours, it had become the squadron's official designation for Wexler's mission. To the rest of the pilots, Wexler wasn't just a ballistics obsessive. He was a jinx. In a dogfight, the only thing that kept a pilot sane was the visual confirmation of his tracers. The glowing hose that allowed him to walk his fire onto a maneuvering Zero. Stripping those rounds wasn't just unconventional. It was a rejection of the only safety net they had in a three-dimensional battlefield. Across the room, a chalkboard usually reserved for tactical formations had been repurposed. At the top, in jagged chalk, someone had written, "The Ghost's Gauntlet." Below it was a list of names and odds. 5-1 said Wexler wouldn't splash a single Zeke. 3-1 said he'd return to the Big E, with 2,400 rounds of unused ammunition because he couldn't find his own lead stream in the clouds. The most morbid bet, placed by a flight surgeon who should have known better, was an even money wager that Wexler would be shot down within the first 60 seconds of engagement, unable to defend himself without the tracer walk to correct his aim. Wexler ignored the board, focusing instead on his K-14 computing gun sight. He was calculating the mill lead for a high-deflection shot at 300 knots. To him, the pilots were gambling on luck, whereas he was gambling on the immutable laws of motion. He knew that the standard Mark 8 illumination rounds, the tracers, created a psychological crutch that actually degraded marksmanship. Pilots waited to see the light before they adjusted, but at the speeds they were flying, waiting meant the target was already gone. "You're making yourself a ghost, Wex," Miller said, his voice dropping the playful edge. "If you get a Zero on your tail, nobody's going to see your return fire. We won't know where to dive to help you. You're flying a dark boat in a storm of fire." Wexler finally looked up, his eyes cold and clinical. "If I do my job, Boots, the Japanese won't know I'm there until their wing root dissolves. I don't need you to see my fire. I need them to be dead before they realize they're being hunted." The squawk box on the wall suddenly shrieked to life, the voice of the air boss cutting through the tension. "Pilots, man your planes. Radar contact. Large formation inbound from the sea beyond sea. Range 80 miles. Launch the alert CAP." As the men scrambled for their helmets, the vibration in the floorboards intensified. The Enterprise was turning into the wind, her massive boilers screaming for speed. Wexler reached for his gear, but his hand hesitated over his G-suit. He could feel a strange, rhythmic thumping coming from deep within the ship. Not the engines, but something closer, something hitting the hull with the force of a sledgehammer. The flight deck of the USS Enterprise was a controlled explosion of activity under the hazy morning sun of October 24, 1944. As Captain Thomas Wexler stepped out of the island's shadow, the tropical heat hit him like a physical blow, thick with the scent of 100-octane aviation fuel and the salt spray of the sea beyond sea. His F6F5 Hellcat, painted in a deep sea blue that looked almost black in the shadows, sat straining against its chocks. To any other pilot, it was just another plumbing special, but to the ordnance crews watching from the catwalks, it was the Ghost's chariot, carrying the most controversial loadout in the Pacific Fleet. Wexler climbed into the cockpit, the metal skin of the plane already hot enough to burn through his flight suit. As he strapped into the parachute pack and cinched the harness, he felt the ship heel hard to port. The Big E was turning into the wind, her 4 massive propellers churning the water into a white frenzy to provide the 30 knots of headwind needed for launch. He went through his pre-flight checklist with the detached precision of a surgeon. Fuel selector on reserve, flaps set to 20 degrees, cowl flaps open. Then came the roar. He hit the starter, and the Pratt & Whitney R-2800-10 WWII engine let out a guttural, coughing metallic rasp before catching. 18 cylinders erupted into a rhythmic, thundering scream that shook the very marrow of Wexler's bones. The 2,000 horsepower radial engine wasn't just a machine. It was a violent force of nature held in check by a few steel bolts and a throttle quadrant. The vibration was so intense that the needles on his instrument panel became a blurred haze. He looked out at his wings, where the 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns were hidden behind soot-stained ports. Inside those wings sat 2,400 rounds of dark, M8 armor-piercing incendiary lead. There was no yellow paint on the bullet tips to signify tracers, no safety net to show him where his lead was falling. The flight deck officer, clad in a yellow jersey, spun his hand in a circular motion. Wexler held the brakes, throttled up until the Hellcat was straining like a leashed predator, and then felt the sudden violent release as the chocks were pulled. He didn't use the catapult. He roared down the wooden planks of the deck, the tail lifting as the R-2800 bit into the humid air. With a final jolt, the deck vanished beneath him. As he retracted the landing gear and began a hard 2,000 foot-per-minute climb, a profound sense of isolation washed over him. Below, the American fleet began to shrink into toy-like shapes. Above, the sky was a vast, predatory blue, soon to be filled with over 400 Japanese aircraft. Most pilots felt a sense of community in the ribbons of light, their tracers created in a dogfight, a way to talk to their wingmen through fire. Wexler had severed that connection. He was climbing into a horizon of enemies completely alone, relying on nothing but the cold geometry in his head and a dark weapon system that even his own squadron expected to fail. He leveled off at 15,000 feet, his eyes scanning the empty glare of the clouds, but as he adjusted his mixture control, he noticed a dark, viscous streak of oil beginning to crawl across the side of his canopy, originating from the very engine that was his only ticket home. The oil streak on the canopy was a jagged, dark vein, but Wexler forced his focus past it, out into the blinding glare of the morning sun. At 0818 hours, the horizon over the sea beyond sea finally broke. A cluster of dark specks emerged from the cumulus towers like a swarm of hornets, the vanguard of the Japanese Imperial Navy strike force. They were A6M5 Model 52 Zeros, the legendary Zeeks, flying in a tight V formation, their Mitsubishi Sakai engines humming with a deadly, synchronized purpose. Wexler kicked his rudder, banking the Hellcat into a steep, sun-blind side approach. His heart hammered against his ribs, a rhythmic counterpoint to the thrum of the R-2800. In any other cockpit in the Pacific, this was the moment a pilot would test his guns, sending a short burst of tracers into the blue to check the walk of his fire. Wexler's fingers remained still. He was a ghost in a machine of shadow, closing the distance with the cold intent of a predator. He singled out the tail-end Charlie, a Zeke lagging slightly on the left flank of the formation. He slid into the 06 o'clock low, the blind spot, where the Japanese pilot's vision was obscured by his own fuselage and tail surface. At 300 yards, Wexler didn't look for a light show. He looked through the K-14 reflector sight, dialed in the 60-foot wingspan of the Mitsubishi, and calculated the lee pursuit curve. His mind was a slide rule of ballistics, factoring in the closure rate and the heavy drop of the API rounds. He squeezed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered as the 6 Brownings roared, the vibration rattling Wexler's teeth, but the sky remained eerily empty of the usual firework display. There were no white-hot streaks, no glowing hose of lead connecting his wings to the enemy. To an outside observer, Wexler's guns might have seemed jammed or empty. But then, the brutal physics of the M8 API rounds took over. The invisible stream of armor-piercing incendiaries slammed into the Zeke's unarmored wing root and the magnesium-heavy engine casing. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment, the Zero was a graceful bird of war. The next, it was a shattering lantern. Without a single tracer revealing the source of the fire, the Japanese plane simply disintegrated. The silver-tipped bullets found the unprotected fuel lines, and the Zero's lack of self-sealing tanks did the rest. It didn't just burn, it vanished into a violent bloom of orange and black soot. The rest of the Japanese formation didn't break. They didn't dive. They continued on their course, blissfully unaware that one of their wingmen had just been erased from existence. No glowing tracers had pointed a finger back to Wexler's position. He had achieved the impossible, a kill in a crowded sky without announcing his presence. He was still invisible. He banked away to reset for the strike leader, his pulse slowing into a chilling, mechanical calm. He was the only man in the sky who knew the massacre had already begun. But as he reached for the throttle to close the gap on his next target, the rhythmic, metallic clanking he had felt earlier returned. Only this time, it was followed by a plume of white smoke erupting from his own cowling. The cockpit clock on the instrument panel clicked to 8:21 a.m. Wexler ignored the acrid scent of scorched oil and the thin, ghostly wisps of white vapor beginning to trail from his cowl flaps. His world had narrowed to the illuminated circle of his K-14 reflector sight and the erratic dance of the Sakai engines ahead. He was no longer a man gripped by the fear of blind suicide. He had transitioned into a state of pure ballistics. This was the flow state, the zone where the roar of the Pratt & Whitney became a distant, rhythmic hum and the chaotic geometry of three-dimensional combat resolved into simple, predictable arcs. He pushed the throttle to the gate, engaging the water injection system for a burst of emergency combat power. He had exactly 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, this formation would reach the outer screen of the American fleet, positioning themselves for a lethal dive onto the carriers. He targeted the next Zeke, an A6M5 Model 52 that was beginning a wide, lazy bank to the left to check its wingman's position. Wexler didn't follow the Zero's tail. He flew his Hellcat to the empty patch of blue where the enemy would be in 2 seconds. His mind acted as a slide rule, automatically calculating the lead, the distance the M8 API rounds would travel at 2,840 feet per second. Without tracers to betray his aim or offer a visual hose to walk onto the target, his first burst had to be a mathematical certainty. He saw the world in vectors, the airspeed of the Zero, his own closure rate of 310 knots, and the gravitational drop of the .50 caliber lead. He adjusted the K-14's range dial, the diamond reticle expanding to perfectly frame the 60-foot wingspan of the Mitsubishi. He squeezed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered under the mechanical hammer of the 6 Brownings, but the sky remained dark. There was no light, no warning, just the sudden, savage reality of impact. The invisible stream of armor-piercing incendiaries lashed across the Zero's cockpit and into the non-self-sealing fuel tanks. The effect was like a lightning strike. The Zeke didn't just catch fire. It erupted into a white-hot furnace as the magnesium tips of the M8 rounds ignited the high-octane fuel. The Japanese pilot never even had the chance to brake. 2 down. The Japanese formation was finally beginning to realize they were under attack, but the lack of tracers was creating a deadly confusion. They could see their brothers falling in balls of fire, but there were no American laser beams to point toward the attacker. To the Japanese veterans, it felt as if the air itself was turning into solid metal. They began to scatter, their disciplined V breaking into a frantic, defensive scramble. Wexler didn't flinch. He dove deeper into the chaos, his eyes darting between the ticking clock and the horizon. 4 minutes left. He banked hard, the G-force pulling the blood from his brain, his vision narrowing to a gray tunnel as he hunted for his 3rd mark. He was about to line up a high-side deflection shot when he realized the white smoke from his engine had turned into a thick, oily black. But it wasn't the smoke that made his blood run cold, it was the sight of a lone Zero, painted with the distinct yellow stripes of a Cento leader, turning back toward him with a precision that suggested he had finally found the ghost in the clouds. By 8:23 a.m., the sky over the Sibuyan Sea had descended into a state of high-velocity delirium. Wexler's Hellcat was trailing a ragged plume of black smoke, but he remained tethered to the cold, mathematical reality of the hunt. To the Japanese pilots of the Imperial Navy Strike Group, the world had stopped making sense. One by one, their wingmen were being deleted from the sky in sudden, violent bursts of magnesium and gasoline, Yet the blue void behind them remained empty of the telltale laser beams of American tracer fire. Wexler banked into a hard, high-side pursuit, the G-force pressing him into his seat until his vision began to tunnel. He ignored the protesting groan of the R-2800 engine. He caught a third zero in his K-14 sight, leading the target by 2.5 diameters. He squeezed the trigger for a half-second burst. The 6 Brownings hammered, and the invisible stream of M8 API rounds tore through the Zero's cockpit canopy. The plane didn't just spiral. It jerked as if hit by an invisible sledgehammer, the pilot dead before he could scream into his radio. Seconds later, Wexler kicked his rudder, slewing the heavy Hellcat to the right. He caught a fourth Zeke attempting a desperate climbing turn. He didn't wait for a perfect solution. He trusted the uniform weight of his dark belts, knowing every round would follow the same ballistic arc without the drag-induced drift of a tracer. A short, concentrated burst shattered the Zero's tail assembly. The aircraft folded like origami, tumbling toward the whitecaps of the Pacific 4 miles below. The Japanese formation shattered into total panic. In their radios, the chatter was frantic. They weren't calling out an American fighter. They were shouting about invisible flak. Looking down at the heavy screen of the American fleet below, the Japanese veterans reached a terrifying, logical conclusion. They were being picked off by a new high-altitude anti-aircraft shell from the ships below. They began to jink and weave, looking at the ocean for the source of their demise, never suspecting that the Ghost was sitting less than 300 yards off their 6 o'clock high. Wexler took advantage of their distraction. He slid into the wake of a fifth Zero, his airframe vibrating so violently from the damaged engine that he could barely keep the reticle steady. He waited until the Mitsubishi filled the glass, then unleashed a 3-second torrent of fire. The M8 rounds found the wing root, and the Zeke turned into a spectacular orange-petaled flower of flame. 3 Zeros had fallen in exactly 90 seconds. He was halfway through his 5-minute window, and the score stood at 5 kills. But as he rolled inverted to target the 6th, a sudden sharp crack echoed through his cockpit, followed by the terrifying sight of his own oil pressure gauge dropping toward 0. The engine was seizing, the Ghost was losing his speed, and for the first time he saw the yellow-striped Zero of the Japanese leader banking with predatory intent, realizing that the invisible fire wasn't coming from below, but from the smoking blue monster right behind his men. By 8:25 a.m., the R-2800 double Wasp engine was no longer a roar. It was a rhythmic, metal-on-metal scream. With his oil pressure gauge needle pinned at 0, Wexler knew he was flying on borrowed time. The friction was melting the bearings of his Pratt & Whitney, but he still had 2 things: altitude and his dark ammunition. He banked the heavy Hellcat into a high-side yo-yo, a vertical maneuver designed to trade excess speed for height, allowing him to stay behind the faster-turning Zeros without overshooting. He pulled the nose into the vertical, the G-force slamming him into his seat as the blue sea and white clouds swapped places. At the apex of the climb, he rolled the F-6F onto its back, peering through the top of his canopy. Below him, 2 Zeros were banking hard, trying to locate the Phantom that had just erased 5 of their comrades. Because there were no tracers, they had no string of fire to trace back to his position. To them, the air was simply exploding. Wexler dove. Gravity gave him the closure he needed. He framed the 6th target in his K-14 sight, adjusted the mill lead for a 30-degree deflection shot, and tapped the trigger. A silent, invisible stream of M8 API rounds tore through the Zero's wing tanks. It didn't just catch fire. The wing sheared off under the kinetic force of the .50 caliber lead. He didn't stop to watch it fall. He kicked his rudder, slewing the nose toward the 7th Zeke. A short, surgical burst disintegrated the pilot's seat and the oxygen bottles behind it. The Zero transformed into a white-hot comet, plunging toward the sea beyond sea. But the 8th target was different. The yellow-striped leader of the Cento unit had finally realized the invisible flak was a lie. He pulled into a violent, vertical reversal, bringing his nose around in a terrifying head-on pass. This was the ultimate test of Wexler's blind suicide theory. In a head-on, pilots usually use tracers to hose the enemy, forcing them to break away. Wexler saw the Japanese pilot's 20mm cannons flickering, bright, rhythmic flashes of light as the enemy tried to walk his tracers into Wexler's cockpit. Wexler didn't break. He stared through the greasy oil smear on his windshield, focused entirely on the shrinking gap between the 2 planes. He held his fire until the last possible second, trusting the uniform ballistics of his all-API loadout. He squeezed the trigger. The Japanese leader saw the American Hellcat's nose buried in smoke, but no ribbons of light came toward him. He stayed on his course, convinced the American had jammed his guns or missed wildly. In his final moments, the veteran pilot likely felt a sense of triumph, until the invisible wall of lead arrived. The silver-tipped M8 rounds shattered his engine, punched through the armored glass, and ignited the fuselage. The Zero exploded so close to Wexler that the Hellcat flew through the debris, the sound of metal scraps hitting the wings like hail. 8 zeros. 5 minutes. The sky was suddenly eerily empty of enemies. But as Wexler leveled out, the R-2800 engine gave one final violent shudder and seized completely. The massive propeller slowed to a sickening rhythmic stop, leaving the Ghost in a terrifying, gliding silence 4 miles above an ocean filled with enemy ships. Wexler looked down at his fuel and ammunition counters, realizing that while he had won the battle of geometry, he had just noticed something on the horizon that shouldn't have been there. A second, larger wave of Japanese aircraft, and he was currently flying a 40,000-pound glider. The silence was the most terrifying part. After the mechanical violence of the R-2800, the cockpit of the Hellcat was now an eerie vacuum, save for the frantic whistle of the wind over the canopy and the ticking of the cooling metal. Wexler was no longer an apex predator. He was a 12,000-pound glider made of duralumin and dead weight. Below him, the sea beyond sea was a shimmering, pitiless blue, but 3 miles to the east, the wake of the USS Enterprise carved a white scar across the water. He had one chance. No engine meant no wave-offs, and no second laps. He checked his altitude, 4,000 feet. He trimmed the elevators, finding the optimum glide slope, his eyes fixed on the Big E as she steamed into the wind. The flight deck was a beehive of activity, recovering the CAP and prepping the next strike wave. Wexler reached for the landing gear handle, waiting until the last possible second to drop the wheels and the tailhook. The drag would be a death sentence if he timed it wrong. On the aft port corner of the flight deck, the landing signal officer, the LSO, stood on his platform, paddles in hand, squinting at the smoking blue silhouette approaching from the stern. The LSO, Lieutenant Sully Sullivan, had watched 100 landings that morning, but this one looked wrong. There was no rhythmic burp of the throttle to adjust the descent, no roar of the radial engine. The Hellcat was coming in dead stick, trailing a thin, oily finger of black smoke. Sully signaled high and fast, then watched in stunned silence as the Hellcat side-slipped with surgical precision, shedding speed without losing lift. Wexler hit the groove, the deck rushing up to meet him. The tailhook slapped the wooden planks, skipped once, and snagged the number 3 wire. The arrestor cable shrieked as it played out, snapping the Hellcat to a violent, neck-wrenching halt. Wexler sat in the cockpit, his chest heaving, his hands still locked onto the stick. The flight deck crews, the yellow shirts and red shirts, swarmed the aircraft. They expected to see a plane shredded by 20mm cannon fire, a pilot bleeding from a dozen wounds. Instead, they found a soot-stained F-6F with a dead engine and a pilot who looked as if he had just stepped out of a library. As the tractor towed the Ghost out of the landing area, Chief Miller and the ordnance crew rushed to the wing roots. They popped the ammunition bay covers, expecting to find empty trays and jammed feeds, the inevitable result of blind suicide. Miller froze. He stared at the ammunition belts. Only a few feet of brass were missing from each tray. The soot around the gun ports was thick and greasy, but the dark belts were nearly full. "Captain," Miller whispered, looking up as Wexler climbed down the side of the fuselage, "the radio reports from the other guys, they said they saw 8 Zeeks explode. They said it looked like God was hitting them with lightning. But you've still got over 2,000 rounds in the wings." The LSO approached, his face pale, looking from the soot-stained gun ports to the empty sky where the light show should have been. He had watched the entire engagement through binoculars, and he hadn't seen a single American tracer. To the men on the deck, it was as if Wexler had killed 8 men with nothing but a thought. But as Wexler handed his flight log to the intelligence officer, he noticed a group of high-ranking brass standing near the island, clutching a set of top-secret intercepted Japanese radio transcripts that turned his blood colder than the altitude he had just left. In the quiet, wood-paneled intelligence office of the USS Enterprise, the Ghost finally saw the transcript that explained the silence of his kill zone. The decrypted Japanese radio intercepts from the Sea Beyond Sea strike group revealed a terrifying confusion. The pilots of the Imperial Navy hadn't reported an American interceptor. They had reported being struck by Denji Ho, a theoretical electronic weapon. They believed the Americans had developed a high-altitude cannon that fired invisible projectiles from the surface of the sea. They died convinced they were being hunted by a machine, never realizing a single man in a smoking Hellcat was calculating their doom from the clouds above. Wexler's performance on October 24, 1944, was eventually catalogued as a statistical anomaly that defied standard Navy doctrine. He had landed with 2,080 rounds of ammunition remaining. He had used an average of only 40 rounds per kill, a level of marksmanship efficiency that was nearly 4 times higher than the fleet average. When the Big E returned to Pearl Harbor, the ballistics reports on Wexler's dark belts were whisked away by the Bureau of Ordnance. His blind suicide loadout was no longer a joke, it was a blueprint. Decades later, in the sun-bleached classrooms of NAS Miramar, the founders of the Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun, would pull Wexler's Leyte Gulf combat camera footage from the archives. The grainy black and white film showed Zeros exploding in midair with no visible line of fire, looking more like a modern laser engagement than a propeller-driven dogfight. The instructors, including legends like Dan Peterson, used the Wexler doctrine to teach a new generation of Phantom and Tomcat pilots about the tracer trap. They taught that tracers were a crutch for the unskilled and a warning for the enemy, forcing their students to master the same cold, mathematical geometry that Wexler had used to haunt the Japanese strike leader. As for the man himself, Captain Thomas Wexler did not seek the spotlight that usually followed the aces. When the war ended in August 1945, he quietly resigned his commission. He didn't write a memoir, and he didn't attend the boisterous squadron reunions where men told tall tales of their ribbons of fire. He moved to a small coastal town in the Pacific Northwest, opening a watchmaker's shop where he spent his days in a different kind of flow state, working with the silent, invisible precision of gears and springs. He lived a life of invisible peace, a man who had seen the loudest moments of history and decided that silence was the ultimate testament to a job well done. He became a ghost in his own community, the quiet old man who fixed clocks and never spoke of the war. To the world he was just another veteran. But in the classified archives of the Pentagon, his file remained open, labeled with a single haunting observation from a Japanese survivor of the Leyte Gulf strike. The survivor, a former Zero pilot found in a Tokyo hospital in 1946, had claimed that while he never saw the bullets, he felt a cold wind on his neck seconds before his wingman disintegrated. It was a sensation that shouldn't exist in the vacuum of ballistics, a mystery that hinted that Wexler hadn't just mastered math, but something far more predatory that the Navy is still trying to replicate to this day. Captain Thomas Wexler spent his entire life trying to remain invisible, ensuring his story would sink into the salt of the Pacific. Most people will scroll past this video, letting the algorithm bury the ghost all over again. Don't let that happen. If you think his genius deserves to be remembered, prove it by hitting like. If you leave this video without subscribing, you're letting history fade back into the silence Wexler fought so hard to keep. Tell us in the comments, was he a hero or a madman? Don't leave him in the dark.